At the time, my family and I went to go visit some relatives we had in a foreign country. I was born and raised in the USA, but we still go back often to visit relatives. My dad didn't want to keep paying for a hotel, so a few years back, we bought an apartment. This trip was our first time staying at the apartment. The way the apartment is set up is there's a living room where the entryway is. It was the only air-conditioned spot. My dad went back to the US to finish up some business as he was going to meet us there at a later time. So it was my mom, my 3 brothers, and I. The landlord who gave my mom the key was sort of creepy from her description, but it didn't really alarm anyone that much. Another important thing to the story is, my mom got the key and met the landlord alone since we were taking care of things at my uncle's house. It had been a few weeks and my mom couldn't stand her room since there was no air conditioning. I didn't blame her, so we all slept in the living room. Nothing out of the ordinary happened until about 4 weeks into staying there. At around 2 a.m., my mom was waking me up, but with a finger over her mouth, basically saying, "Keep quiet." My mom never does this, so I shut up and made a hand motion, asking what was going on. She pointed to the door and someone was jiggling the doorknob. We had forgotten to lock the door, but thank God my older brother got into the habit of using chain locks from his college days. It should be noted that my brother was dead asleep in another room, so I was now the oldest male. My mom was distraught and I was thinking about what to do. I was thankful that at least the chain lock was there, but I think the man on the other side noticed that was all. I see a face pressed up from the small gap. It was the landlord. He finally gives up after about 10 minutes, or so I thought. The next thing I see is a coat hanger trying to open the chain lock. I finally decide to do something, so I body check the door, slamming it shut. I locked the actual lock and yelled in a foreign tongue, and the man seemed surprised to hear a man's voice. I guess he assumed my mom was alone and the only one to check in. He scrambled down the stairs. All said and done, he was gone by 2:30 a.m. I looked out the window across the street at the landlord's house. He just stared at me, and then turned off the lights in his house. When we woke up, I told my brother. We called the police, but they said we didn't really have any evidence. It was our word against his. My mom wasn't sure it was the landlord, but I swore it was him. I had seen him. My dad arrives 4 days later, and I told him the story. He met with the landlord and agreed he was creepy. My dad actually believed me. My mom didn't feel safe anymore, so we left that apartment the day after my dad arrived. As we drove away, the landlord gave me a little smirk and wave. By now, it was daylight. A few years ago, my roommate Chloe and I moved into the perfect apartment in a 6-unit building. It was on a street we immediately fell in love with. Chloe and I are both in our early 20s, who moved from a small town to a major city in the last 5 years, so we felt like real adults living in this place. Within the first couple of weeks, we began to suspect we were in close proximity of an ongoing domestic dispute between the tenants in the unit upstairs. At this time, we hadn't seen or met them, so we really had no idea the context of the relationship. A man's loud, angry ranting, with no shortage of aggressively insulting comments, responded by inaudible mumbles, prompted us to think a woman may be in a potentially violent environment. Chloe and I decided we would try to listen in case things ever escalated too far, and maybe try to offer the woman help in the meantime. That's if we ever met her. Over the next 6 weeks, we continued to hear him, but we had not seen anyone, and there were no real developments. When he was really loud, we tried to record him on our phones. One Sunday afternoon, I was home alone cleaning my kitchen, which was located at the back of our unit. The man upstairs was having a very loud and long rant, and for the first time, I heard a clear response. I could make out a woman's voice telling him to shut up and leave her alone, in an almost annoyed rather than fearful tone. He did not appreciate that and began yelling at her. which eventually led to him banging something against his floor. Eventually he did one so hard that my kitchen lights began to flicker. I could see debris falling from the ceiling. This freaked me out, and I called my boyfriend Ted. When Ted answered, I whispered into the phone, "Don't say anything, just listen." The man upstairs continued to yell, but it wasn't until there was another bang that Ted could hear. I said into the phone, "That's my upstairs neighbor. He's been going on like this for a long time. I've been trying to record some of it." Here's where the story really takes a turn. Considering how clearly we could hear him upstairs, it makes sense he could make out what was being said below him. All 6 units were connected by a stairway outside at the back of the building. I heard very loud steps running down them. Next thing I know, there are 3 heavy raps on my door and an angry voice saying, "So you can record my conversations, but you can't answer the door." I was instantly paralyzed and worried he would come by the window where I was standing. After about 20 seconds, I heard the steps return upstairs and that familiar voice call up, "No one's home." I collected myself from the shock and fear of what just happened. I left my apartment to make some calls. I decided to phone my landlord first, as he seemed like he would know what to do if we were having issues with another tenant, and I was very confused about what was happening. I told him the chronology of events since moving in, and he provided me with some very interesting information. The tenants above us was a mother and son, Rita and Ivan. Ivan is 36, and him and his mom have been living in the building for 10 years. During that time, Ivan never had a job, and in the last couple of years had caused some problems for the landlord, specifically him and the previous tenant of our unit, who had moved out over a year ago, had butted heads several times, which is why my landlord had decided not to mention anything to us. He knew Ivan had some issues, but assumed it was an isolated and contained issue. The last thing the landlord had told me was that while the previous tenant was in our unit, Ivan had approached them, accusing her of installing something in his wall to listen to him. Maybe I'm dense, but this did not set off immediate alarms. Something more serious was going on with Ivan. I was still believing the woman's voice I heard belonged to someone in danger, so I called the city non-emergency police line, who sent a car over to make sure she was safe. She was, and they promptly left. After our call, the landlord began to build a case to evict my upstairs neighbors, on the grounds they were impeding on other tenants' ability to enjoy their space. Things upstairs had been mostly quiet for 2 days, until I was in touch with the landlord again over the phone. He provided me with some more information, specifically that he believed when Ivan was ranting, it was towards the previous occupant of our unit, rather than Rita. This obviously seemed odd to me, but we were still trying to piece everything together, so we had to keep an open mind. The landlord also reiterated how Ivan really changed in the past couple of years and had caused problems before. His reasoning for not giving us a heads up before moving in was that since the last tenant had moved out, he had been quiet and kept to himself. In the days after this call, the ranting started up again as we waited for an update on the eviction process. That Friday, we received confirmation that Rita and Ivan had been served with their first warning of eviction, so we expected to hear some action. Sure enough, that night while I was in bed, I heard Ivan's voice from above. "Shh, I'm trying to listen." At this point, I'm definitely concerned, but I really had no idea where this was going and how quickly. The next evening, Chloe called me while I was at work. She told me she thought she heard a knock at our back door. I told her I wouldn't be home for a couple of hours, but if she was concerned, I could leave early, or she could call the non-emergency line. Chloe told me she was going to see if anything happens, and that she would be okay. At around 10 p.m., I came home, and by midnight, I was on the phone with the non-emergency myself, because Ivan had come downstairs to my back window, where I was standing, asking us to leave him alone, because we were harassing him. Chloe and I had been in our kitchen talking about our days, having agreed we would try to live our lives despite the situation. At one point, the subject of upstairs briefly came up, And the next thing I knew, the man I had only ever physically seen once, with long, dark, greasy hair and a look of emptiness in his eyes, was standing at my back window, next to where I was sitting. My immediate response was to pull out my phone and start recording him. "Yeah, you can record me," he said. "Can you leave me alone? You and your friends harass my home every day." This got my adrenaline going, and suddenly I heard myself call back, "Bye, Ivan." I called the police and we waited for them to arrive. When he went back upstairs, he started ranting to Rita and said some very weird and unsettling things. He said we were sexually harassing him, and that us, the landlord, and the previous tenant were all associated. He then mentioned the bat we have beside our back door, which he wouldn't have seen at the window. Therefore, he had listened to us mention it. He also knew my name, having only ever seen me once. The police arrived and essentially told us there was nothing they could do. They knocked at Ivan and Rita's door. However, no one answered, and they stayed silent. The officer advised us to go to the station the following day and have a specific officer assigned to check in on us and monitor everything. They left, and I called my boyfriend to come and stay over for the night. In the hour after the police left, Ivan ranted sporadically, repeating much of the same things we'd been hearing in the past week. Ted came over. He heard for himself what was going on and agreed it was very unsettling. Banging came from upstairs, and Ted said he was going to go out back for a smoke, that if Ivan came outside to call 911. Ted had injured his back the previous week and was concerned if Ivan was going to try to come downstairs again. He decided to bring the bat with him. Minutes later, Ivan had come outside and was standing at the top of the stairs, yelling that he was going to knock us out. He started coming down the stairs when Ted picked up the bat, telling Ivan to stay upstairs. I called 911, and our downstairs neighbor came outside to help us, having heard the commotion. The police arrived, and I experienced some of the saddest minutes of my life. For starters, when the police went upstairs this time, Rita answered and completely defended her son. The woman we had initially been concerned was at the receiving end of domestic abuse, told the officers we were not leaving her son alone, that he'd almost been attacked by my boyfriend. The police said there was nothing they could do and left us for what felt like bait in order for our concerns to be taken seriously. They left. We heard Ivan amp up again. This time he was saying he was going to kill this downstairs, so we packed up and left for the night, each staying with a friend. That was a tough night, as we both came to realize this apartment we thought was so perfect had a pretty fatal flaw. We had no idea how this was going to end. We met up the following day, and after encouragement from our families, we went to the police station, needing real help with a potentially dangerous situation. It was eventually arranged that charges would be placed on Ivan for uttering death threats. Chloe and I each gave a testimony, and the officers told us they would be going to the apartment to arrest Ivan. They advised us not to stay there for the night, if possible, in the event he refused to be taken by them, as this could escalate things. Without a warrant, the police had no way of forcing Ivan to go with them, but I had a feeling he would be, since I heard him at one point mention that he was the one protecting their home. Sure enough, when the police came to the building, we packed overnight bags. Ivan let them take him away, despite his mother's protests, which included accusing us of lying and threatening them. We packed up our things, watched him get taken away, and we left, never spending another night at that apartment. Since all of this, there have been a few updates. First of all, we moved, and the landlord was very generous in his reimbursement to us, having known Ivan had issues that he greatly underestimated. Aside from not wanting to be sued, I really believe the landlord to be a decent guy who just made a judgment call that went completely wrong. We received a few updates on the legal proceedings, both from the charges that were pressed and the landlord's eviction process of Rita and Ivan. Ivan was released the following day on bail with a number of conditions, and we're waiting for a court date, I guess. The landlord is also waiting for a court date, having filled all the pre-required documents. The final piece to this completely bizarre sequence of events was the Facebook profile we found, having looked him up on a whim. Ivan hadn't posted in 3 years, which lined up with the timeline of when the landlord said he began causing problems. He had some unsettling posts that we provided to the police, in addition to frequent mention of a relationship he was in. He has dozens of posts about the person, with no response, including no likes on any of it. It's strictly posts made to an anonymous person who had no interactions, nor did anyone else. Having researched what I believe Ivan is suffering from, I am curious if this relationship ever existed, or if it was another delusion. That's the story. Thank you for listening to it.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel as essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
The year I turned 10 years old, my mom and I moved into a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in what is statistically considered one of the safest cities in America. We moved out just a few years ago after my grandmother passed away, but I spent 12 years living in this place. The apartment was one of 5 in our building. You know how a duplex has 2 units in the same building, split down the middle. This building was quartered into 4 units with an added unit on the lower level. We had the unit above the lower level. Our landlord at the time was kind of a If something broke and needed fixing or replacing, he would come and attempt to fix it himself instead of just hiring an expert, and all the while he'd make comments about how women break things. What can I say? Anyway, at the time of the story, I was 13 years old. Our dome landlord rents out the lower level unit to a lovely young couple. Their names were George and Lisa. On the night they moved in, I remember they had music just blasting from their new home as they moved furniture in boxes down the stairs with their friends. It was uncharacteristically loud for the neighborhood, but none of us other residents actually had a problem with it. They seemed pleasant enough. The pleasantries lasted about a week before George and Lisa started having these blowout screaming matches. My mom and I would hear her start screaming and cussing him out. He tried to get her to back off and calm down, and then they moved on to the next stage, which was slamming. Always after an hour or so of this, things would go quiet. Then Lisa would be heard in the back of the house, where the bedrooms were, just sobbing. There was one day where I heard Lisa walking around outside, having a conversation with herself in different voices. A few more weeks and we began to notice that George and Lisa got a lot of strange visitors at strange times, who always seemed intoxicated and sometimes banged on our huge living room window without knowing whose window it was. When it was very quiet, I heard scraping sounds coming from the kitchen area, a lot. One time I heard George and Lisa having the most obnoxious sex I've ever heard. The night things went too far for us was when a woman showed up at 3 in the morning with an empty milk jug and started ringing every doorbell to our building, scratching at the front door, trying to get in, moaning and yelling for George and Lisa. She disappeared after a few minutes, and suddenly we hear the back door to the building jiggling. You could tell there was more than one person trying to break in. My mom called the police and we gathered our things and went to a restaurant for breakfast, exhausted after no sleep. We then went and booked a hotel for the night. We just couldn't deal with them again. After we complained to the landlord and the police multiple times, things got quiet and really awkward between us and the neighbors. And that's when the FBI showed up. I go to answer the door and the man and woman ask if they can talk to my adult. I say sure and lead them to my unit, which we always kept open during the day anyway. And right there, they open a binder and show us photos of George and Lisa. They ask if we happen to have seen them before, and we tell them they live downstairs. It turns out they're both living under false identities, major fraudsters, and dealing cocaine. Shortly after this, George and Lisa moved into the apartment building across the street, and they were arrested within a month. This happened a few years back. I was 23 years old, married, and had a stepdaughter. I'm a female, divorced from my ex now, and I don't see my stepdaughter anymore. But at this time, I was living with them, my cousin, her husband, and their son. We had a townhouse on a dead end that led to some train tracks in my hometown. The neighborhood was decent, but had a lot of houses close together and was highly populated with children. There were usually toys, bikes, and skateboards hanging around on the sidewalks and on the front lawns of houses. This included our house. We resided in the second and third floor of the house, while our landlord's daughter occupied the first floor. Shortly after moving in, 2 tenants moved into the basement apartment, a middle-aged couple. They seemed alright, but were eerily quiet at first. They started showing some signs of drug use and just started showing some odd behavior. For example, they would scream at the top of their lungs at each other over petty things, like wanting a ride somewhere, and the other not wanting to give that ride. It was starting to scare our kids. I had a bad feeling about the guy, John. In our state, we have access to criminal records. We can search anybody's state police record. I exercised that right and found out that this guy had pending sexual assault charges against him. Now I was terrified, scared of the kids playing outside, scared of the kids being in the same building as this guy. Weird things started happening, like we would wake up in the morning and the kids' toys would be broken. Not just broken, but destroyed. Skateboards would be completely broken in half. My wagon was completely mangled, and toys were thrown down an embankment we had behind our house. We all had a feeling it was him, but we couldn't prove it. Tension had already started to build. It was clear we didn't like seeing each other, but everyone was so passive-aggressive about everything, until this day. I was dropping my ex off at work while my cousin kept an eye on the kids. They played at the neighbor's house in their fenced-in yard. My phone rang when I was a few blocks away from home. It was my cousin. I remember her saying, "I think we're going to have a problem." I asked her why, and she said, "John is throwing down the embankment and knocking over the garbage bins." My first thought was, those things are full. He must be making a mess. And boy, was I right. I pulled into my driveway to see all of our recyclables scattered across the edge of my driveway. It made my blood boil. I got out of the car and looked over at his door on the side of the house. I saw him throw something out of the doorway, and we met eyes. As soon as that happened, I took that chance to confront him. I punched this 6'5" man in the face. It didn't exactly drop him, but it did knock him down. He fell back and kind of bumped into his van. He fell on his ass in front of it. To put things into perspective, I'm 5'8", and at the time, I had some extra weight on me, so I wasn't a tiny helpless girl. After this, he got up. With a vengeance, he threw punch after punch after punch. So did I. I was starting to get weak. My arms felt like spaghetti, and I couldn't see a thing. I could hear my stepdaughter screaming, and my cousin yelling for help from the upstairs window. I wiped my eyes, and to my surprise, I saw my other neighbor restraining John. He was still trying to attack me, even after being restrained. I was bleeding badly. I didn't realize it right away, but my nose was broken. My 4'9" cousin was standing in my front yard with a metal chair over her head. My stepdaughter was taken inside with my other neighbor's kids. John was screaming at me. I was just screaming back at him, calling him crazy, a diddler, and telling him nobody wants him here. It felt like a segment of Jerry Springer in between a KY Jelly wrestling match. I ran upstairs to look for my cousin's husband. The scared little man that he was in the window calling the police. When I realized he was useless, I headed back out. John was gone. He took off. The rescue and police arrived where I was questioned. Then I was taken to the hospital. I was released soon after and was about to head out to pick up my ex, whom hadn't even known what happened yet. But I couldn't find my keys, my car and house keys. We checked everywhere and couldn't find them. I started feeling like John stole them before he took off, but they were with my phone. Why wouldn't he have taken my phone? I called the police station and they informed me he was picked up. I took a shot in the dark and asked if they found my keys on it. I described my keys, green New York Yankees bat keychain. They confirmed yes, he did have them. They asked me if I would like to press further charges. I, of course, said yes. There was a no contact order active, but technically they could not make him leave the house. That was up to my landlord. My landlord kicked them out, not before they could squeeze some stalking and harassing in. My good neighbors turned their security cameras on, facing our house. One morning his girlfriend was standing in front of the house, yelling at us. When we watched it on the footage, what we couldn't see was that he was standing right at our door. She was the bait, he was the hook. Thank God we didn't bite. They moved out, and it was peaceful for the rest of the time they were there. I still see them here and there, usually walking and usually looking angry. Good.
So in 2012, my then-girlfriend and I went on a big year-long road trip through the States, working on farms along the way for room and board, and ended our trip by driving across Canada, west to east, stopping back in Nova Scotia where we lived. At some point we got a puppy, and around the time we got to Alberta, with an extra mouth to feed, money was running out. Since I'm a carpenter, I decided to find a place to rent, and I would get a job for a few months before we kept going on our trip. We scrolled through Kijiji, the Canadian Craigslist, and eventually found an ad for a place. There was this one guy who lived in a very cool-looking house and was only a short drive from where I had found a job at. He wanted someone to move in with him to help out with the bills. We started corresponding with him by email. I told him that I was going to work in the area and my girlfriend would be staying home with the puppy. Being desperate and having become accustomed to trusting strangers throughout this long trip, we agreed to send him a deposit and take the offer. We got to this place a few days later. It was in the middle of nowhere and there were no neighbors, but we had known that before. This guy looked to be about 30 to 35, small-framed, and just looked like a regular working country dude. Except his expression was weird. It was like he was scared or something. He almost looked like he was ashamed of himself. He was fine with our dog being inside, though he had a dog that wasn't allowed inside. This struck me as weird since this is the cold Canadian North. Right away, he met us at the door, and I felt there was something off about him. It made me uneasy, especially since I would be going off to work every day, leaving my girlfriend alone with this creepy guy. But she didn't seem worried, and I didn't want to be controlling, so I let it go. The first night we were there, he wanted to have a few drinks with us. We obliged politely. He brought us a few cans of shitty watery beer, and meekly drank his while sitting across the kitchen table from us. We tried to relax the situation and asked him a few friendly questions about himself. His answers were brief and quiet. He seemed to want friendship, but also seemed completely unsure of how to get it. He went over a few rules he had. Number 1 was to stay out of his room, which was obviously fine. Number 2 was that we were not allowed to go into the basement. Kind of weird. And number 3 was to stay away from the barn. By this point I could imagine the headlines. Nova Scotian couple found murdered, bound in barn. That night I didn't sleep very much. I wasn't supposed to start work for a couple of days, so I just stayed up reading and playing with our pup. I heard his truck pull out of the driveway pretty early in the morning. I headed for the basement because I just had to know what was down there. It was pretty bare. Just a few washing and drying machines and some lawn chairs. But I opened a closet door and found a weird nurse costume that looked like it was for sexual purposes. A roll of duct tape, a set of handcuffs, a shotgun, and a box of shells, all sitting together on the same shelf. I woke up my girlfriend and explained that she no longer had any say in the matter and that we were leaving before he got home. We sent him a message after we left, lying, saying that one of our family members had gotten sick and we were moving back home. He never offered to return our money, and we had no more contact with him. I'm still waiting to see him in the news. My ex thinks that I worry too much, but her parents thanked me profusely. And I still wonder what was inside that barn.